So 3 weeks ago, we began the quarter by a study of Old Testament precepts of faith and obedience. And we talked about, if you recall, in the first quarter, the importance of the study of the Old Testament. And we also talked about those precepts that we will consider over the course of this quarter, the doctrines and the principles that we find in the Old Testament that are important to us, and to help us have a better understanding of God's will, a better understanding of the New Testament, a better understanding of our relationship with our Heavenly Father. And so this morning, I want to tell you, I thought about this particular lesson for a long time and considered how to present it. This lesson is going to be a little bit different, to be honest with you. And the purpose of this lesson is to prompt us to think in regard to God's master plan, God's scheme of redemption, if you will, but more specifically about our relationship with Him today and God's relationship with His people from the very beginning throughout the Old Testament, the New Testament, first century, but to prompt us to think about our relationship with God. So as we look at this lesson, keep this thought in mind. Consider it from the standpoint of, or in light of, God's scheme of redemption, God's plan. We not to overemphasize this point, but from before the foundation of the world, God had a plan. And that is evident to us as we study through the Old Testament. It becomes more evident that God had a plan from the very beginning, from before the beginning, for each of us. Everything that we study points toward Christ. And so Isaiah chapter 1, I think about, and we're going to key on one particular statement that Isaiah makes in verse 9. And I've titled the lesson, The Refining of the Remnant. And the idea is that we look at this in consideration of you and I today being the remnant. And so I just wanted to introduce our thoughts with those comments and those thoughts in mind, and how we consider our relationship with God today as we look back at God's relationship with His people, specifically the children of Israel and Judah, and the difficulties, if you will, that they went through, the challenges that they faced, the characteristic. You know, one of the characteristics that always comes to my mind when I study God's people and the children of Israel is the description that's given numerous times that they were a stiff-necked people. And I think about that a great deal, and especially as we look at Isaiah chapter 1, that becomes evident. So I want to read the first 9 verses to introduce our thoughts, and then we'll move forward. Chapter 1 of Isaiah. The vision of Isaiah the son of Amos, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for the Lord hath spoken. I have nourished and brought up children, and they have rebelled against me. Immediately, we see the relationship that exists between God and His people. The ox knoweth his owner, and the ass his master's crib, but Israel doth not know, my people doth not consider. A sinful nation, a people laden with iniquity, a seed of evildoers, children that are corrupters. They have forsaken the Lord, they have provoked the Holy One of Israel into anger. They are gone away backward. Why should ye be stricken any more? Ye will revolt more and more. The whole head is sick, and the whole heart faint. From the sole of the foot even unto the head there is no soundness in it, but wounds and bruises and putrefying sores. They have not been closed, neither bound up, neither mollified with ointment. Your country is desolate. Your cities are burned with fire. Your land, strangers devour it in your presence, and it is desolate as overthrown by strangers. And the daughter of Zion is left as a cottage in a vineyard, as a lodge in a garden of cucumbers, as a besieged city. Except the Lord of hosts had left unto us a very small remnant, we should have been as Sodom and should have been like unto Gomorrah. I want to stop right there. We're gonna read further as we study and make points, but I want to stop right there and consider what Isaiah says in the description of the condition of Israel. Israel and Judah steeped in idolatry. That's what he says. They had, verse 2, rebelled against God, forsaken the Lord, verse 3. Look at the descriptive language that is used and the strength, if you will, of that language. Gone away backwards. They were in apostasy, verse 4. As a body full of sores, verses 5 and 6. But then maybe the most descriptive thought or the most telling thought is the comparison in verse 9 that they were compared to Sodom and Gomorrah and the corruptness of those cities. And so as you look at the condition of God's people, he paints a picture for us of the condition that they were in. And all of those words give us a description of that. But one of the things that impresses me about this, and this is kind of what I want to key on as we go forward, is the fact that in verse 9, God spared a remnant. Except the Lord of hosts had left unto us a very small remnant, we should have been as Sodom and Gomorrah. So God spared a remnant, and the idea of a remnant is simply just one who is the Vines describes as a remainder, a survivor, if you will. That which is left is the definition of what a remnant is. Again, as we consider this in light of the scheme of redemption, think about Christ, think about the church. We'll talk about those things. But he describes over in chapter 10, if you look at verses 20 through 22, it is a remnant that will turn back to God. Now, realize, and I probably don't have to say this, but God's people had been in, forgive me, thought left me, Babylonian captivity. And there was a small remnant that would be left and that would turn back to God. So anyway, back to chapter 10 and verse 20. It shall come to pass in that day that the remnant of Israel and such as are escaped of the house of Judah shall no more again stay upon him that smote them, but shall stay upon the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, in truth. The remnant shall return, even the remnant of Jacob, unto the mighty God. For though thy people Israel be as the sand of the sea, yet a remnant of them shall return. The consumption decreed shall overflow with righteousness. The Apostle Paul would later quote that in Romans chapter 11, I believe it is. We'll refer to that later on. But the remnant that will turn back to God, a remnant that chapter 11, verses 9 through 12, Isaiah says God will recover that remnant. And in that day, verse 10 actually, and in that day there shall be a root of Jesse, a reference to Christ, which shall stand up for an ensign of the people. To it shall the Gentile nation seek, and his rest shall be glorious. And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people, which shall be left from Assyria and from Egypt and from Pathros and from Cush and from Elam and from Shinar and from Hamath and from the islands of the sea. And he shall set up an ensign for the nations and shall assemble the outcast of Israel and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. And so as we read this, there will be an ensign, he says, from the root of Jesse. That's described as a flag or a signal or a banner, a reference to the coming of Christ. Romans chapter 15 and verse 12 tells us that it's an ensign for all the people. That's an indicator, both Jew and Gentile. When Paul was writing to those Roman brethren about that particular point, that both Jew and Gentile are God's chosen people if they obey through their faith. A remnant that will be refined in the furnace of affliction. Turn over to chapter 48 of Isaiah in verse 10. In the description that he gives there. Verse 9, actually. For my name's sake will I defer mine anger, and for my praise will I refrain from thee, that I cut thee not off. Behold, I have refined thee, but not with silver. I have chosen thee in the furnace of affliction. For mine own sake, even for mine own sake, will I do it. The beginning of verse 11. And so, as you look at the refining of the remnant, what does he say here? In the furnace of affliction. The description is as a goldsmith would refine gold. What's the purpose? To bring them to their knees, to soften their hearts, to turn them back to God. And so I wanted to introduce the thoughts here and look at this. I know we kind of go quickly, but as you look at this, one of the points the first point that we'll make and consider is the fact that God's remnant has always existed throughout the Bible. Now that's something to me that's important to help us in this study. And we could also add to that point that it continues to exist, the remnant of God. And again, as you look at that and consider it in light of God's scheme of redemption, it begins to paint a picture for us, if you will. Go back to the period of the flood, the wilderness wandering of the children of Israel, when Israel became divided, Israel and Judah. Go to the New Testament, the early church. Paul's going to refer to it in the book of Romans, chapter 9 and chapter 11. But the remnant has always existed and it continues to exist. Look at the example in the outline of Seth. Seth, in Genesis 4 and verse 26, Abel and the apostasy of Cain, Seth and his descendants became the remnant of God. Look at the example of Noah, chapter 6 of Genesis and verse 8. The description there, the statement that's made about Noah is that he found grace in the eyes of God. What took place with the flood? God destroyed the world with flood, with water. Who did he save? Noah and his family, those 8 souls on the ark. And so the remnant there of Noah. What about Joshua and Caleb and the example there that you find in Numbers 13 and 30? When they were sent, the 12 spies were sent into Canaan. Who came back and said, we can take the land? Joshua and Caleb. In chapter 14 and verse 24, I believe, if I remember correctly, the statement there is that Caleb wholly followed the Lord. Is that right? And so as you look at the examples, one of the examples that we'll emphasize is the example of Elijah. You remember the statement that he made in 1 Kings 19? What Elijah said to the Lord? What is that? I am the only one that is left. I and I alone am left, and they seek to take my life. Elijah was in what we would probably call today is a state of depression because he felt alone. We're going to look at the response that God gave Elijah. And Paul uses that as an example to the brethren in Romans, again, chapter 9 and chapter 11. But look at also the returning remnant from captivity, Isaiah chapter 11 and verse 11. I'll just refer to that. But the fact that there has always been the existence of a remnant throughout history, throughout the Old Testament, even into the New Testament, and that continues today. I wanted us to think about that in light of God's plan, in light of our relationship with God, and what it means to us today. So when we talk about this, the point number 2, I don't think we can consider it without making this particular point in regard to God's plan and his purpose, God's spiritual remnant, the true Israel of God, as Paul describes over in Romans chapter 9. You know, if you look at turn over and let's just highlight a couple of verses. But Paul is making the point, the argument, the admonition, if you will, to those brethren, in particular the Jews that had rejected Christ, who the true Israel of God is. If you look at Romans chapter 9, beginning in verse 4, let's just highlight and read a few verses to help establish the point. Who are the Israelites? To whom pertaineth the adoption and the glory and the covenants and the giving of the law and the service of God and the promise? Whose are the fathers, and of whom, as concerning the flesh, Christ came, who is over all, God blessed forever. Amen. Not as though the word of God hath taken none effect, for they are not all Israel which are of Israel. Neither because they are the seed of Abraham are they all children. But in Isaac shall thy seed be called. That is, they which are the children of the flesh, these are not the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted for the seed. Go down to verse 27. Isaiah also crieth concerning Israel, though the number of the children of Israel be as the sand of the sea, a remnant shall be saved. We'll go a little bit further, but as you look at that, what is Paul telling those Roman brethren right there? Verse 7, you're not the remnant, you're not God's chosen people because of your heritage, because of the fact that you can count your relationship back to Abraham. That does not make you the true Israel. Not because of your physical relationship, not the fact that you're grandfathered in, so to speak, because of your relationship with Abraham. In other words, it's not by inheritance. That's not what's under consideration here, and that's the point that he's making to them because they were holding on to that, right? Not simply rooted in simply being related to the right person, but it's interesting, don't you think, when he says in verse 4, who are the Israelites? Who is the true Israel of God? They which are the children of the flesh, these are not the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted for the seed. He's trying to establish the point that the gospel is for both Jew and Gentile, right? He's trying to make them understand that the gospel is for all. It's not limited or restricted, if you will, for the Jews only. But as we look at it, what's the point that we can apply to ourselves? The remnant consists of those that are considered the saved. Verses 24 through 27 we read. Look at verse 29 of Romans chapter 9. And as Isaiah said before, except the Lord of Sabbath had left us a seed, we had been as Sodom and been like unto Gomorrah. He's quoting from Isaiah chapter 1, verse 9 that we read just a moment ago. What shall we say then? That the Gentiles which followed not after righteousness have attained to righteousness, even the righteousness which is of faith. But Israel, which followed after the law of righteousness, has not attained unto the law of righteousness. Wherefore? Because they sought it not by faith, but as it were by the works of the law, for they stumbled at that stumbling stone. Here's again a reference to Christ, as it is written, behold, I lay in Zion a stumbling stone and rock of offense, and whosoever believeth on me, on him, shall not be ashamed. So when you look at this, and there's obviously we can't get all the points in that we need to today in regard to this, but we can make the point to help establish what we're trying to get across. The remnant consists of those that are saved, both Jew and Gentile. If you go over to chapter 11 of Romans 20 through 23, he describes it in regard to an olive tree, those that are grafted in. Well, as we look at it, what he's already indicated here in chapter 9, it's not according to the letter of the old law, the law of Moses, if you will, but there is a condition. And we can make a point here. We can make a statement here. The fact that God has never made unconditional promises to his people. Right? Go back to this is just one example, Deuteronomy chapter 7. And this is the one example. But I want to read this because this theme is probably not the right word, but this thought from the Lord carries through the entire Old Testament. But Deuteronomy chapter 7, beginning verse 6, for thou art a holy people unto the Lord thy God. The Lord thy God hath chosen thee to be a special people unto himself above all people that are upon the face of the earth. The Lord did not set his love upon you, nor choose you, because you were more in number than any people, for ye were the fewest of all people. But because the Lord loved you, and because he would keep the oath which he had sworn unto your fathers, hath the Lord brought you out with a mighty hand, and redeemed you out of the house of bondage from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Know therefore that the Lord thy God, he is God, the faithful God, which keepeth covenant and mercy with them that love him, and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations, and repayeth them that hate him to their faith, and destroy them. He will not be slack to them that hate him. He will repay them to his face. Thou shalt therefore keep the commandments and the statutes and the judgments which I command thee this day to do them. That's just one example that we can think of when we think about the fact that God has not made unconditional promises to his people, conditioned upon their faith and obedience, right? Well, the same holds true today. Go back to Romans chapter 1. God requires of us an obedient faith. If you'll notice, if you read through the book of Romans, beginning in chapter 1, in verse 5, he says that the faith by whom we have redeemed grace and apostleship for our obedience to the faith among all nations for his name. He concludes the book, the letter, in chapter 16 and verse 26 with that same statement. Obedience to the faith. So what does God require of us? An obedient faith. Secondly, Romans chapter 1, 16 and 17, we're very familiar with those verses, but he requires a life of faith. Verse 17, for therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. So he also requires an active faith. Chapter 2 and verse 7, continuance in well-doing. Paul is establishing what God requires of us, the precepts here of faith and obedience. A genuine faith, Romans 6, 17 and 18, those who obeyed from the heart is the description that's given there. A serving faith, you're familiar with Romans 12, verse 1. Present your bodies a living sacrifice. And so when we put all of these together, when we look at these in consideration again of our relationship, we understand that God requires a faith that is more than just mental acceptance. An active, obedient faith is the requirement that God has of us. He even talks about in chapter 11, verses 20 through 23, the warning, if you will, the condition of unbelief, those that he describes that would be broken off. Those, and he just describes there in verse 23, I believe, it is the severity, the goodness and the severity of God, that we should fear him. So I know we kind of moved through these 2 points quickly, but I wanted to get as far as we can in this lesson and for us to consider some things when it comes to this. Point number 3. Well, let me pause right here. Any comments or anything you would add up to this point? Point number 3. What about the discouragement? And this is kind of the point that I want us to consider. The discouragement that comes with being the remnant. Turn again over to Romans chapter 11. This is Paul's description, if you will, recounting of conversation between the Lord and Elijah. And he begins by posing a question in chapter 11, but we'll read the first 5 verses. I say then, hath God cast away his people? God forbid. For I also am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God hath not cast away his people, which he foreknew. Wot ye not what the scripture saith of Isaiah, how he maketh intercession to God against, Elijah, how he maketh intercession to God against Israel, saying, Lord, they have killed thy prophets and digged down thine altars, and I am left alone, and they seek my life. But what saith the answer of God unto him? I have reserved to myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to the image of Baal. Even so then, at this present time also, there is a remnant according to the election of grace. A spiritual remnant is what he's referring to here. And so that question that Paul raises in Romans chapter 11, hath God forsaken his people? He prompts the Roman brethren to think about this and what's under consideration here. But when you look at that in regard to, I believe the American Standard Version uses the phrase, has he cast off his people? But has God forsaken his people? A conclusion could be reached by thinking about the rejection of the gospel and those who reject the gospel and those who have ultimately rejected God. God's cast off his people. There's no one left. The example that Elijah says, I'm all alone. I'm all by myself, and they seek my life. And so there can be a level of discouragement that can come. So the question, that Paul poses is, God cast away his people. But what is the divine response that God gives here? What does he say? What is he? I've reserved to myself. I have reserved to myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. What's God saying? Elijah, it's not as bad as you think it is. You're not all alone. God has said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. So we look at the divine response here, go back to chapter 10 of Isaiah, verses 20 through 23. I think we read that a minute ago. Isaiah prophesied, the remnant will return. The remnant shall return to God. So look at it in light of today and the situations that we face today and the events that we see that take place and the condition of the church today. Oftentimes, and I hear this so often about the church, not what it once was. The church is not growing. The church is not what it was back in the 60s. The church is much smaller. Well, that's evident if you look at the numbers, right? So I think about this from our standpoint and how we respond to what we read in chapter 11 and how we respond to our situation that we face today, even now, East Huntsville congregation right here. And so you look at this, it could be very easy for us to be discouraged by those who reject the gospel, couldn't it? I think about it in terms of those men, Bill and Matt, who stand in the pulpit, and Mark, and those who preach the gospel. It'd be very easy to be discouraged because there's not a great response to the gospel, right? An eldership, members, why are the pews not full? Why do people not see? I believe that's one of the questions that Paul has in mind here in chapter 11 when he talks about the power of the gospel in chapter 1, but then why do they reject the gospel? Elijah was discouraged. And so, again, focus on the divine response that God gives. He didn't say, Elijah, maybe we ought to change the message. Maybe we ought to lower the standard a little bit so that more people would be accepting of the message. Or maybe I should reconsider my will for you. So there's a danger in discouragement. There's a danger in thinking this way, as Elijah did. it can breed a desire to change what God has authorized. A compromise or even indifference or a relaxing of the truth, if you will, that can be seen, and we do see it in a change in worship. Let's make our worship service more appealing to the crowds. Let's change what God has authorized so we can bring more people in. God's standard regarding divorce and remarriage. Let's relax that standard a bit so that more people will be accepting. So can you see then the discouragement that comes and what can be a result of that discouragement, but God's divine response? Mark, you're about to make a comment.
I think all human beings want to be part of the problem. There is a desire to be part of something larger than oneself, especially something that society is saying. Watching the comedy show not too long ago, they were talking about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
I believe they describe themselves as the remnant. Is that right? I believe that's right.
What I was thinking is that actually applies in the case of what Jesus said. Jesus said, "Woe to you all men, speak well." So they said, so perhaps what we need to be thinking about is, no, nobody was saying anything against us. Everybody was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we should question. Maybe we should go back further and question biblical systems. I've heard a lot of people say that. Oh, the church was really well in the 50s and 60s. But how deep is that commitment? We certainly have people who are in that. That's true. But there's a question in my mind, the remains in my mind, was it because it was more popular then? The people as in its movement, as those who are left, not really into it. We certainly see if they were faithful.
I don't either. I think that's a good observation. I look at the history of East Huntsville and where we were in the 60s and where we are today, and I don't know that I have an explanation or an understanding necessarily. I think about the first century church in Acts chapter 2, and if you read through Acts chapter 2 and all the persecutions that the church faced at that time, all the difficulties they faced, if you read chapter 2, Bill's made points on this. Those that obeyed the gospel on the day of Pentecost sounds like a big number, but in perspective of all that were there, actually pretty small. So really, I appreciate your comments because when we think about the discouragement that can come, do you understand the point that we're trying to make here? And again, go back to God's plan from the beginning and His relationship with all of those that we've cited as an example, and then His relationship with us today. What does that tell us today in regard to our relationship to God and what we're doing? Keep our focus on what we're doing, right? Keep preaching the truth of the gospel. Keep diligent in focusing on serving as we've been instructed to. So the question, has God cast off His people? Not at all. Not at all. I think, obviously, the Apostle Paul answers that very, very well. Any other comments? Any other thoughts? Application of the lessons that we learned very quickly. We only got a couple of minutes, but some of the things that kind of hit you really directly when you look back at Isaiah chapter 1 is at one point that becomes so evident, and there's a danger, a warning, if you will, in verse 3, and that is the fact that God's people can cease to know Him. But look at how it is here. It's not through ignorance, is it? But it's through rejection. They've rejected Him. They rejected God, but they yet, in verses 11 through 14, they worshiped Him in vain. They recreated God in their own image to make him what they wanted him to be. They were in a state of apostasy. Second Peter chapter 2, 20 through 22. They were, as the description that Peter gives there, they were entangled again, once again, after they had received a knowledge of the truth. And so that particular point, I think, is very evident as you look at Isaiah chapter 1 and try to pull out lessons from it. God's people can cease to know him. Point number 2, verses 11 through 15. We didn't read those verses, but very quickly, to what purpose, verse 11, is the multitude of your sacrifices unto me? Isaiah poses the question from God, saith the Lord, I am full of the burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed beasts, and I delight not in the blood of bullocks and or of lambs or of he-goats. When you come to appear before me, who hath required this at your hands to tread my courts? Bring no more vain oblations. Increase is an abomination. Incense is an abomination unto me. The new moons and Sabbaths, the calling of the assemblies, I cannot away with. It is iniquity, even the solemn meeting. Your new moons and your appointed feasts, my soul hateth. They are a trouble unto me. I am weary to bear them. What is he saying? God prefers quality over quantity. As you look at, he poses the question, what's the purpose of your sacrifices to me? I am weary to bear them, is what he says. Vain religion is what's under consideration here is repulsive to God. What does he desire? That our worship be genuine and from the heart and a worship of sincerity. Vain religion is sin. Matthew 15, 7 through 9, you're familiar with it. In vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrine the commandments of men. Where does that apply? When we talk about worship, it applies in our singing, it applies in our prayers, in the Lord's Supper, and what we preach from the pulpit. Every part of our worship would be under consideration here. Well, time has caught us. I apologize. We didn't get through as far as I wanted to. You have the outline. I appreciate your comments and your kind consideration. Thank you.